Another race of domination for Red Bull and Max Verstappen as they've got past a Leclerc pole position for the fourth time in a row. It means that this championship fight is surely one-sided from this point. But that wasn't all that was happening in Baku, as there was drama up and down the grid. So here's my 5 things we learned from the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Perez causing strategy challenges for Red Bull. It was Sergio Perez that took a second place on the grid for Red Bull, out-qualifying his teammate in Baku. And it was this qualifying performance that was building on his race win in Monaco that's put him right in this championship fight. The fact that Ferrari faced a double DNF this weekend meant he's now Verstappen's closest title rival this year, and it's likely that he will continue to be the closest for the rest of this season if reliability concerns for Ferrari continue. But once Perez took the lead of the race through turn 1, there was a problem for Red Bull as they got to the virtual safety car triggered by Carlos Sainz. In this situation, Ferrari went for the cheap pit stop despite being just 10 laps into the Grand Prix, and the Ferrari team seemed to take a gamble on whether they could make it to the end of the Grand Prix on a hard set of tyres in the baking heat. Generally, Red Bull are very strong on strategy, and the sensible thing to do in this 2 cars versus 1 scenario was to match Ferrari with at least one of the cars. That way, they could have covered Leclerc off, but generally, with the potential weaker strategy, they would put the driver running second on the road on that option. But when Verstappen, the championship leader, was in that position, Red Bull took a risk and didn't match the Ferrari strategy. Of course, it didn't play out in the end because of the Ferrari power unit problem for Leclerc, which we'll talk about shortly. But it was interesting that they didn't compromise a driver on this occasion. After the race itself, Perez did comment that they had planned to come in for a pit stop but didn't communicate clearly or on time for Checo, which is a bit of an unusual situation given Red Bull is often the most consistent team from a strategy perspective. Who knows what that could have done for the team in the rest of the race. Later in the Grand Prix, it was Verstappen that made a move on Perez into turn 1, and the Mexican driver was told that there would be no fighting his teammate. And to be fair, Verstappen was certainly faster on Sunday as he went on to get a comfortable victory on a circuit that cost him so dearly in 2021. But the fact that Perez is in the mix is something of a double-edged sword for Red Bull. They will be pleased from a Constructors' Championship perspective, but it makes things very difficult when there isn't a clear leader in the Drivers' Championship. So for me, it's a green box for Perez as he's making this title fight very interesting indeed. Ferrari's poor reliability will cost them. It was a great qualifying performance for Leclerc once again as he scored his 4th consecutive pole position of the season in Azerbaijan, but he failed to finish the race after another power unit failure. It was the second time in 3 races where he suffered a power unit problem that resulted in his retirement, and that's something that's surely going to cost them in the World Championship. Early on in 2022, it was Verstappen and Red Bull that were struggling, but as the engines have aged, it's clearly been Ferrari that's failed to produce a reliable power unit this season. It looked like a pretty catastrophic failure for Leclerc, who held a comfortable lead in the race at the time, albeit with a risky strategy to manage his hard tyres to the end of the race after an early stop under the virtual safety car. It wasn't the only reliability problem for Ferrari though, as Carlos Sainz suffered a hydraulics failure to trigger the VSC in the first place. If that damaged the power unit as well, then Ferrari is surely going to suffer more engine penalties through this season than their Red Bull competitors, which means that these problems that have been costing them early on in 2022 will hurt them even more later in the year with grid drops. Sainz has had so many issues this year and has dropped further behind George Russell in the championship standings. He's now 67 points behind the championship leader and is now well and truly out of it in my opinion. For me, with a gap of 34 in the Drivers' World Championship between Leclerc and Verstappen, and a gap of 80 in the Constructors' Championship, it's now a win or nothing for Leclerc in the next few races to ensure he can keep himself in this championship fight. He's now scored 15 pole positions, but has won on just 4 occasions. And he clearly has immense talent over 1 lap, but his car hasn't been there for the races to ensure that he can convert these pole positions into victories. So it's got to be a red box for Ferrari, as they've clearly developed a competitive car, but they just haven't got the reliability. Before we take a look at George Russell and Mercedes, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. YouTube's telling me that 80% of the people who watch my videos aren't yet subscribed to the channel, and I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already and are enjoying the videos, please do consider subscribing. George Russell maximising his result once again. This season there's just one driver that's been able to score a top 5 finish in every race, and that's George Russell. Despite the Mercedes team not being the strongest this year, Russell has maximised his performances and really got the best from his car. He's been the driver that more often than not has picked up the pieces whenever the cars ahead had retired. On this occasion he was there once again, and was ahead of his teammate in both qualifying and the race. There are many reported reasons why Hamilton has been behind Russell this season, and Hamilton has apparently been carrying heavier sensors and running different setups on his car so that the team can learn as much as possible. This has surely cost Hamilton lap time and meant he's been unable to compete so far up the order, and it may well mean that the Mercedes team could speed up their development through this season. But regardless, it was always going to be a season to prove himself for George Russell, and that's exactly what he's done, as he's racked up his 3rd podium of the season and is right there in the mix with the Ferrari drivers in the standings. It was a great result for Russell once again, and he's definitely confirming that he's the future for that Mercedes team. So it's got to be a green box for the young Mercedes driver this week. Porpoising out of control. The Baku Street Circuit hosts one of the longest straights on the calendar, and as such, the cars were set up to have less downforce than most other tracks we've seen so far this year. As such, with the rough street circuit surface, the porpoising this weekend was worse for all teams than we've seen at any other track so far this year. It was a real concern to the extent that Hamilton didn't even finish his long run in practice to protect his back. Even teams with less porpoising in general, such as McLaren, were struggling down the start-finish straight as it was clearly the best way to maximise the lap time. But it was also a challenge for the drivers. When Daniel Ricciardo saw Hamilton's porpoising on the TV feed, he commented that it was far worse than what he'd been experiencing in his McLaren. You could even hear it on the onboard shots, and it feels like an intervention could be necessary if this trend continues, as you can be sure that the drivers won't want to increase the ride height if that costs them lap time. But they've clearly taken risks on what the drivers can handle in this race, and it was just lap 29 when Hamilton claimed his back was killing him during the race, with obviously a very long way to go. And at the end of the race he looked exhausted getting out of that car and in a serious amount of pain. Given this challenge for the drivers, there is of course a chance that the driver that has been fatigued by porpoising could make an error, or even the vibrations themselves could damage the cars, which is something that a few of the teams saw early on in the weekend as they tried to repair floor damage before the cars went into Parc Fermé on Saturday. In the race itself, Yuki Tsunoda seemed to suffer a rear wing failure that could have been worsened by the porpoising, which meant that his DRS flap had split into 2, meaning only half of it was opening down the straight. Yes, this might not have been caused by the porpoising, but it seems like it could have made it worse. But having said this, I think the porpoising isn't easy to regulate or intervene with. Setting a minimum ride height would severely impact some cars more than others, particularly those that have the porpoising more under control, like Red Bull. Alternatively, they could use some kind of vibration sensor to manage it, but that won't be an exact science. So for me, it's a problem for the teams and drivers to manage and learn how to control, rather than something for the FIA to intervene on. But it's an amber box for the porpoising, as it's something that clearly isn't pleasant to watch, or for the drivers. But it's an interesting challenge for the teams to manage going forwards. AlphaTauri finding their form. The final box today, for me, goes to AlphaTauri. The Red Bull Junior team have struggled so far in 2022. Before this race they sat 7th in the standings and were a long way behind Alpine ahead of them. But in Baku, the team seemed to find their form as they were 6th in 8th after qualifying and were well in the mix in case of retirements ahead. Pierre Gasly in particular, a driver with a point to prove this season given his slow start and the fact that his contract was up at the end of it, did well to split the two Mercedes drivers on Saturday. Going into the race, Gasly was competing as high as 4th as he benefited from a VSC cheap pit stop at the start and then gained again from the Leclerc retirement. In the end, Gasly took 10 points for 5th position, a great result and his first points finish since Melbourne. All season it's been much closer between Tsunoda and Gasly, and it was close between the two of them on track today as well. And without a reliability concern for Tsunoda's car towards the end, they would have been next to each other on track come the checkered flag. The Japanese driver was unfortunate to lose out after his rear wing split in 2, but I think he certainly deserves some credit for a good performance this weekend despite ending up out of the points with his additional pit stop. It was a good way for AlphaTauri to pull themselves up in the standings away from the likes of Aston Martin and Haas and towards the likes of Alpine. So for me, it's got to be a green box for AlphaTauri. Honourable Mentions. The first honourable mention for me this week goes to Sebastian Vettel. He would have had a box for himself if it wasn't for that disappointing mistake as he tried to get past Esteban Ocon into turn 3 and went straight off into the runoff area. Regardless, he still finished 6th with a strong result for Aston Martin, especially considering how bad Stroll's weekend was as they tried to get that B-spec car up to speed. The next honourable mention for me goes to the roadblocks that were the Alpine cars. They were so difficult to overtake on Sunday as they had some strong straight line speed, and they got rewarded for being tough to overtake as they both opted to not stop at the first virtual safety car and ended up with a double points finish with 7th and 10th. A decent result for the Alpine team. So it was a strong race for Red Bull as they've gone clear of Ferrari, and they look like they'll be the team to beat for the rest of the season. It looks like the next race on F1's return to Canada could well be make or break for Charles Leclerc.